For placing a bead, there's basically two different ways that some designers like to do it. One is they will have you put it on this stitch that is to be knit, and sometimes the instructions will say PB for place bead. And when you do that, what they want you to do is to place the bead on that stitch and then knit it. Oftentimes designers will do something different, which is to knit the stitch and then ask you to place the bead on there. I think the thing to be aware of when you're placing beads on work is that you're basically putting a bead between two stitches. So I'm using two different colors. I thought this would show. Basically, if we're placing a bead on this stitch, it's going to be locked in by the stitch that we're knitting right after it. So let's start out with the easiest method. Let's just try a crochet hook. So with a crochet hook, as you recall, we just pick up a single bead, and let's say the designers asked us to place the bead on the stitch that is to be knit. So what I do is I remove that stitch from the needle and I gently slide the bead onto the stitch. Now, as you can see, it doesn't want to gently slide on there. It's the trouble I have with crochet hooks sometimes. I try to use the bead to go onto the stitch rather than trying to pull the stitch through with the crochet hook. The crochet hook has a tiny, tiny little loop there that can sometimes just grab part of the yarn, and it's really easy to shred it. So that's why this hasn't been my favorite method. That would be the con. The pro is that it's really easy to just pick up one bead and stick it on there. So here we have a placed bead, and to finalize this, we just knit the stitch. So as you can see, you have kind of like imagine an hourglass figure with a tight belt. We have a stitch below it and we have a stitch above it, and it's resting in between those two stitches. Now if we were to knit the stitch, and pardon me for moving this back to the left-hand needle, it's just the way I'm used to beading, but that stitch has been knit, and so if we were to place a bead on it, it's actually kind of an incomplete stitch at this point because we have knit from the row below, but this little bead isn't going to be locked in until the next row, because when we knit the next row, there'll be a stitch that's above that. This actually sometimes creates a tighter placement of the bead than this method here, but this is more unusual to have a designer request to do it that way. Usually they'll have you place the bead, then knit it, as opposed to knit, then place. But that does happen sometimes. So the crochet hook is easy to use, but I do find it is a little bit grabby on the yarn because this is so small that it doesn't grab the entire yarn like a crochet hook that would be meant for that size yarn would do. I've been able to use a slightly bigger one. This is a size 6.90. This is a size 4, 1.25 millimeter, and I find this one shreds the yarn a little bit less, but it probably would only work for the larger beads like the Miyake beads. Some of the smaller beads, it may be getting a little bit large. Here's a couple of beads that are check beads that don't have the uniform holes, and that really is actually kind of stuck on there. It doesn't want to go on there very easily. So this one I would not be able to use if I were using different brands of beads that don't have uniform holes. I'd probably be pretty comfortable using this one with the Miyake or maybe Toho beads, but this one I would use if I were using the ununiformed holed beads. So I like this a lot. It's fast, but it does tend to kind of grab and snag the yarn sometimes. So let me show you one more time before we go to the next method. So basically, if we were placing a bead, we would get a bead on our crochet hook. We would slide the stitch off with the crochet hook and then move the bead onto the yarn. Try not to snag and tear right here with the crochet hook. Return it to the needle and knit the stitch. It's now locked in place, and as you can see, it's with the black and the gray yarn that it's in between the black and the gray. Whereas when we did this other one where we knit the stitch first, then put the bead on, it's completely on that gray yarn. So you can kind of see the different placement of the beads here with the different methods. This is a little higher, but it will be locked in when we come back and purl on the other side. Okay, crochet hooks. So the next method is very similar. It's using our Fleegle Beader that we loaded up before, and as you recall, this end was to load the beads, and then we have this other end that, like a crochet hook, has like a little sharp, tiny hook. Now this has the same issue in that the hook is very tiny, and it can sometimes just grab some of the yarn, and I've had it want to shred the yarn sometimes, but let's see how this goes. If this didn't have that shredding property, I probably would use this method more than anything else, but we go ahead and we grab and we try to push the bead onto the yarn, and I'm always tempted to try to pull the yarn through, but that I think is what shreds it. So there we go, we slide it on there and we knit, and the advantage here is that I have beads sitting on the Fleegle Beader and I don't have to stop and reload. Okay, once again, we'll just take this stitch off, carefully slide the bead onto the stitch, and you can see I'm already starting to shred this. I don't have this technique down. Slide the bead on and place it back on the needle and knit. Okay, so that's the basically placing a bead method with individual stitches using a crochet hook or a Fleegle Beader. If we wanted to try to use the method of the dental floss, as you recall, we had three parts of the dental floss. We had the stiff end, the fuzzy bit, and this is a very used piece, so we can really see the fuzzy bit here. And then we have this long, thin end. So I moved my clip up to close to the fuzzy end, so I have my beads moved up. And if we were to place a bead, let me get a little bit along here. It's very similar to the other methods where we put it on the stitch that's to be knit. So we're going to basically take that stiff end and put the stiff end inside the stitch, bend it around to where that fuzzy part is, slide one bead up past the fuzzies, and stick it into the little sharp pointy end. So now it's on both the fuzzy and the sharp pointy end. And we're going to slide the stitch off and slide the bead up, put the stitch back on, and then take the dental floss out. So this is, to me, a bit of a fiddlier, slower method, but it is the most gentle method there is. If you have beads like these that are not quite uniform in their whole size, then I find it doesn't shred the yarn. It's also really good for yarns that are really not plied tightly and tend to shred a lot, or really fine, delicate yarns. I don't think I'd want to use the Fleegle Beader or even the crochet hook with those, but this is, I've never had any trouble with this ever shredding yarn. It's always a very gentle way of doing it. It's also a nice thing if you're traveling or visiting one of your friends' houses for a knitting group to have your beads strung on a string like this, because then they're a little bit more contained and more portable, and your friends will appreciate not having to pick beads up off their floor, as often happens. So that basically is an alternative that a lot of people swear by, and I actually, if I'm doing a lot of beading and I'm having trouble with the yarn, I do come back to this method a lot. I think it's just a real gentle way on the yarn. So basically, again, we slide the bead up that we need over the fuzzy bit. I put the little sharp end or the stiff end into the stitch, fold over, put the sharp end through the bead, so now the bead is on both the sharp end, or rather the stiff end, and it's also on the fuzzy end, if I can get my dexterity working here. Okay, so we have that folded, slid, and then we have the bead going onto the stitch. Take it off, put it back on, remove the floss, and then there we have our beads in place there, and then we knit it. Now the other thing is they come in a lot to a box. You probably don't have to reuse them very often, but I find if I've completely loaded this thing up with beads and I've done a lot of beading with one of these pieces, it's easy just to go ahead and trim this little piece right here, and you can get that sharp again. It will tend to get a little bit dull and frayed if you've been using it a lot, but it's a nice method. So all of these methods I think have their advantages and disadvantages, and some people will swear by each. I would say that I do different things depending on the project. If it's just a couple beads, I tend to grab a crochet hook. I am still a little bit nervous about the Fleegle Beader, I think because I had some bad experiences with it when I first started and did a little bit of yarn shredding, but I think my technique is probably better now, so I should try it again. And again, the other method with the dental floss I think is the most gentle and perhaps the easiest to keep track of your beads with. So those are the various different options. Hope you enjoy beading with your work. Bye.